Some of the country's leading business figures call on the RBA to lift interest rates. The flood crisis in Sydney escalates, and Virgin is winning the battle for domestic customers. It's Wednesday, the 9th of March, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, you know what? I'm really looking forward to today's interview that comes up after the show because it is with the CEO of a company that is probably the most frequently mentioned company on this podcast, apart from the banks and some of the big miners.
Apart from lots of other ones. It's certainly the most frequently mentioned small company on this podcast. It's biotech mesoblast, of course. Silviu Itescu is the CEO. Now, it's a pre-recorded interview, so I know what's in it. It's great. Admittedly, I don't know a lot about biotech companies, but Silviu has this ability, he just runs through the drugs that they're trying to develop, why it's taking so long, where it's up to. Fantastic interview. In fact, I would say this is one of my favourite interviews in recent months, Michael.
And the reason I love it is just because this is a company that's been mentioned so many times because of the enormous fluctuations in its share price. One day it goes up by 15%, the next day it's down by 11%. It's just up and down because it's tied to all the medical research, it's tied to the Food and Drug Administration in the US, it's tied to other deals with medical companies. It just goes up and down. So it's fascinating to hear you talk to him. Anyway, finally, at last, Sean, pressure is mounting on the Reserve Bank, as I mentioned before, to lift interest rates. But the pressure isn't coming from economic data. It's coming from business leaders and some heavyweight business leaders at that.
Sure is, Michael. Former Federal Treasurer, now Chair of the Future Fund and Nine Entertainment, Peter Costello, yesterday called on the Reserve Bank to get with the curve on interest rates, saying the current situation of record low interest rates and high federal deficits was absolute rocket fuel for the economy. Now, Mr. Costello was speaking at the Australian Financial Review's annual business summit. He also said the China-Australia relationship is at its lowest ebb, though added that the trade that matters most hasn't been interrupted. He didn't say it, but he's talking iron ore. However, the contraction of free trade, which has occurred in recent years, will be bad for global growth, Mr. Costello said. At the same conference, former Reserve Bank board member and now Australian National University Professor Warwick McKibben said the central bank should consider raising rates soon, but it needs to be done in conjunction with fiscal policy, i.e. the federal budget, and climate policies, i.e. energy policies. Financial markets expect the bank to lift interest rates 2 or 3 times this year, even though Martin Place has continually said it will be patient on rate rises. The business community are now urging the bank to move on rates. What most experts agree on is that when it happens, the already slowing housing market will be hit.
Sean, another speaker at the conference was James Gorman. He's the Australian who runs Wall Street powerhouse Morgan Stanley. Now, towards the end of last year, everyone was involved in this big debate over cryptocurrencies and whether cryptocurrencies have a place in investment portfolios. Everyone from super funds to fund managers were all getting in on it. James Gorman weighed in yesterday. He wasn't overly enthusiastic about crypto.
Yes, that's true, though he didn't totally dismiss them. He said they were a speculative asset and over time regulators will regulate cryptocurrencies. They'll never actually replace reserve currencies. Mr. Gorman is among the most senior global financiers and he has a big stake in the world economy. He said China needed trade to deal with its own internal economic challenges, including poverty. That's part of the reason why Australia and China will stay linked for a long time. He also said cutting off oil and gas supplies too soon would be naive, and we're talking in terms of climate change here, because ultimately the public won't put up with the cost of much, much higher energy if the change happens too quickly. So what he's saying is phasing in renewables is the only way to go, and certainly don't count out oil and gas just yet.
Okay. How did the local equity market perform yesterday, Sean?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 finished the day down 0.8% to 6,980 points. The energy companies and material stocks led the market lower on the back of some relief in oil, coal and iron ore prices. Rio Tinto and Fortescue Metals both fell more than 4%, while BHP was off 3%. Oil and gas giants Woodside and Santos both dropped more than 3.5%. Now remember, they had surged in previous sessions. BlueScope Steel was the worst performer, down 8.5%, while miner South32 was off about 6%. There were reports yesterday that Gold Digger St Barbara was a potential acquisition target that helped push up its share price almost 11%, easily the best on the day.
What about international markets?
The big news overnight is that the United States has decided to ban the importation of Russian oil, gas and coal amid growing bipartisan pressure to stop financing the invasion of Ukraine. The United Kingdom said it will ban oil imports, but not natural gas or coal. The commodities provide much-needed money for Russia, and the plan is to financially cripple Moscow, even if it sends energy costs higher at home. In early afternoon trading, Wall Street was up around 1%, while tech stocks were doing even better. Most European bourses finished lower overnight. Amid all the soaring commodity prices, I've been remiss, Michael, by not mentioning nickel. It's up 90% since last Friday. It's now trading at 14-year highs. Natural gas prices were also up sharply after Russia warned it could cut off supplies to Europe.
Okay, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Scott Morrison was in campaign mode yesterday, telling a national conference that the coalition is strong on national security and the economy. Feels like we've heard that before.
Who would have thought there's an election coming up? Anyway, Mr. Morrison said Australia was operating in an era of radical uncertainty, with the world a more uncertain, less stable and more dangerous place. He defended the government's handling of the economy and pandemic, adding that the highly complex and risky external environment meant running the country was no place for amateurs. It's pretty clear who he was referring to at that point. Mr. Morrison defended the coalition's policies on the environment, saying they struck the right balance between acting on climate change and supporting traditional emissions-intensive industries. He also said it will take time to get immigration back up and running again.
Sean, it was International Women's Day yesterday. It was really good to see, and it's noticeable the difference in recent years, the amount of coverage as well that International Women's Day gets, and particularly with some of the business publications as well, really highlighting the contribution and the role of senior women in business.
Yes, what I thought was really good yesterday, you're right, so much coverage about it, and it highlighted some of the really important issues that need to be addressed to improve the imbalance that's there at the moment. For example, the very impressive Samantha Mostyn, who runs Chief Executive Women, she talked about the inaccessibility of childcare as being one of the key factors holding women back. Expert 360 Chief Executive Bridget Loudon, who also sits on the Telstra board, she said that just over 50% of GDP is unpaid care work, which is overwhelmingly carried by women. She also mentioned that she expects hybrid working in coming years to be accepted as much by men and women. And another really big issue was brought up by Christine Holgate, and it's very relevant. Now, Christine Holgate is the CEO of Toll Holdings and former boss of Australia Post. She said employers could act right now by paying women super when they take extended breaks. That might be for childcare, personal care, domestic violence reasons. If companies paid super, then women wouldn't retire with less money than men necessarily. I think that's very important as well. Really good to see some of these issues debated and discussed yesterday on International Women's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, anyone living in Sydney knows about the deluge that hit the city, with major flooding hitting low-lying sections of the metropolis. And Sean, even people who don't live in Sydney would have seen some of the images of this, including shots of a bridge in the air that has flooded pretty much on its own, well above the water, but just because of drainage issues, basically there were just cars floating along a bridge.
That bridge, Roseville Bridge, is actually very close to my place, and it's 40 metres above the water level. But as you say, the flooding is quite phenomenal. In fact, certainly more than I've ever experienced. There were more than 50 evacuation warnings in Sydney and along the south coast in Illawarra in New South Wales yesterday, including one that impacted 60,000 people living along the Georges River in Sydney's west. The Hawkesbury River flooding is now at equivalent levels of last year. The big difference between this year and last year, though, is just how far and wide the flooding across Sydney is. At least 2 people have died, and the New South Wales State Emergency Service said it has received thousands of calls for help. Hundreds of defence personnel last night were diverted from northern New South Wales to Sydney to help out. Along the mid-north coast of the state, residents of Kempsey have been urged to evacuate while there's been landslides in the Blue Mountains. That area has been declared a disaster area. Prime Minister Scott Morrison is expected to announce more emergency relief funding in coming days. The Bureau of Meteorology said the worst of it should now have passed, though it continues to rain along the coastline, and any rain at this point is too much.
Yeah, indeed. Now, Sean, Australia has announced fresh sanctions on Russia.
Yes, Foreign Minister Marise Payne said 10 individuals with strategic interest to Russia will be hit with sanctions for their role in encouraging hostility towards Ukraine and promoting pro-Kremlin propaganda. There'll also be additional sanctions targeting Russia's armed forces and financial and travel sanctions against 6 senior military commanders responsible for implementing the ground and air attacks on Ukraine.
And Sean, I think this is a bit of a bizarre reflection on the world that we're living in at the moment, where we actually have to have a daily war update, essentially, in fear and greed. But what is the latest out of Ukraine?
Well, Russia has intensified its shelling of key Ukrainian cities, with the land battle somewhat stalling, at least in the north of the country around the capital of Kyiv. Civilian neighbourhoods have been under attack, the US claims. Meanwhile, 500 more US troops are being deployed to Europe to reinforce NATO's flank, mostly in Germany. Knowing exactly what's going on the ground is difficult, with various reports of Russian troops advancing and also sometimes reports of them retreating. Away from the military activity, Michael, big businesses continue to pull out of Russia over the past couple of days. The big four accounting firms, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte and EY, have all pulled out of the country. That involves tens of thousands of job losses.
Sean, to something a little bit lighter, Virgin Australia seems to be winning the competition for domestic flights in the country at the moment. Not bad for an airline that 18 months ago was in administration.
Yeah, I totally agree. According to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's latest quarterly report on the airlines, Virgin carried 34% of domestic passengers in January. Now, it was at 22% when it went into voluntary administration in November 2020. Qantas and Jetstar each had 31% in January, and Rex had about 4%. The competition watchdog's reports say there's been significant price reduction in the 9 routes serviced by Rex. Just shows what competition does. In January, there were 2.5 million passengers flying, which is still less than half the pre-pandemic level. Now, the report came as Qantas boss Alan Joyce said he expects Jetstar to get to 120% of pre-pandemic capacity by the middle of this year. He was also asked about the use of electric planes, and he said they were possible on very short routes, but are actually less efficient on longer routes because the batteries needed for those longer routes are heavier than jet fuel. Mr. Joyce also added that if oil prices remained high, airfares would go up.
Okay, Sean, what's making headlines in today's news media?
Well, Michael, the Financial Review is reporting that Fortescue boss Andrew Forrest has signed a memorandum of understanding with French aircraft manufacturer Airbus to research regulation, infrastructure and supply chains to deploy green hydrogen aircraft. Mr. Forrest's goal, eventually, is to create zero-emissions jet fuel. And the Australian is reporting that the Chinese Foreign Minister has cast Australia as the US's most loyal accomplice in a sinister strategy to constrain the rising power of Beijing with an Indo-Pacific version of NATO.
All right, running through some of the other stories around today. Australian business conditions and confidence rose last month, Sean, as the pandemic eased, according to the NAB monthly business survey. The improvements in conditions showed up in the employment index, in trading and in profitability. Confidence rose across all industries and most states, with the exception, Sean, of WA and Tasmania.
Along the same lines, Michael, the weekly ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index rose by nearly 1% last week, though remains well below its long-term monthly average. The survey, however, was undertaken before the most recent flooding along the east coast, so we'll wait and see how that's affected confidence.
Sean, you mentioned the trade of oil before. Fuel refiner and retailer Ampol said it won't buy oil from Russia, condemning its actions in Ukraine. 2 Russian cargoes, which were purchased ahead of the invasion, are already on the way and will be unloaded before the end of next month. Meanwhile, competitor Viva Energy said it's also going to stop buying Russian oil. It has 2 cargoes as well already on the way to Australia.
And Michael, March was supposed to mark the return of workers to offices in the CBD, but so far it hasn't really happened. The office occupancy level in Sydney is 18% and it's 15% in Melbourne, according to the Property Council of Australia. However, the council expects those rates to jump significantly in coming months.
What's it going to take to get people back into the CBD?
I love some of the entreaties big firms have been putting on staff to come back, free coffee, free food, better after-work facilities, those types of things. But I reckon, a lot of people will still work from home, especially Mondays and Fridays.
Yeah. I don't know. It feels like a lot of people have had a taste of the flexibility that remote working can offer. And if there's a hybrid available, then probably makes sense that most people would opt for that, wouldn't they?
I'd say so.
Okay. All right. What's the key overseas news this morning?
China is developing one of the greatest nuclear weapons forces in history, while Russia will exploit every opportunity to undermine the US and its allies, according to the annual threat assessment by the US Office of the Director National Intelligence. And Iran will continue to threaten American interests as it seeks to erode US influence in the Middle East, according to a report on Bloomberg. At the same time, North Korea is committed to expanding its nuclear arsenal and ballistic missile development.
Sean, that's just a whole lot of bad news right there, isn't it?
It is. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, none of them like the US. That's what that says.
Give us something a little bit better. Have you got anything better?
Not really. I'll tell you one though. Shares of Toyota's truck-making subsidiary Hino suffered their biggest one-day fall in more than 2 decades, falling 17% in the first trading session since the company admitted it had falsified emissions data. Hino said late last week that it had falsified diesel engine performance and fuel economy data for some of its vehicles manufactured in Japan. Now, the company, which has sold more than 115,000 trucks and buses with falsified data as of February, will stop selling. That's all according to the Financial Times. And Michael, no country enjoys gas guzzlers like the US. In fact, the US summer, which is otherwise known as the driving season, consumes more oil than almost any other annual event in the world. And while America is pushing into electric vehicles, there are still about 276 million registered vehicles on the road, of which 273 million are internal combustion engines. So, rising fuel prices really matter. And the national average price of fuel in the US has set a new record this week, on the back, of course, of rising oil prices, of $4.10 US a gallon. That makes fuel a major political issue. However, I don't feel too sorry for them. That record high equates to about $1.46 a litre. I used to be paying just that much for fuel in Australia.
Sean, I really should not be admitting this right now, but I never knew the conversion between gallons and litres. So I've always been a little bit curious about, you see what they're paying in the US. Wonder how much that equates to per litre, but I've always dismissed it as one of those things that just seems too hard to work out.
And by the time you put the exchange rate in, and
yep.
I think the litre to gallon's about 3.7 litres to a gallon, I think. And then by the time you put the exchange rate in, etc. I agree, it's all too hard. You need a calculator.
Oh, well, I've got you. I don't need a calculator. $1.46 a litre. Thank you very much.
There you go.
Now, Sean, up next, you're speaking to Silviu Itescu, the CEO and founder of the ASX-listed biotech Mesoblast. A great chat.
Yes, one of my favourite in the last couple of months. Listen to it.
Indeed. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 9th of March, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and make today the day you tell a friend about Fear and Greed. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.